If you're making any of these common A/B testing mistakes, you're not running your tests properly and your data could be compromised. Today, I'm going to show you how to avoid the most common A/B testing mistakes so you can get trustworthy results that you can implement. Hi, I'm Deborah O'Malley, founder of GuessTheTest and CEO of ConvertExperts. I'm a top A/B testing influencer and leading women's CRO specialist. I've run hundreds of tests and seen and analyzed thousands. And today I'm going to show you what I've detected as the most common mistakes in A/B testing. This is the number one thing you need to avoid. So listen up because it's a very simple mistake, but so often made. Can you guess what it is? It is not running a sample size pre-test calculation ahead of actually launching your study. Now, doing this is a huge problem that leads to a number of issues in testing. First of all, it leads to untrustworthy data. The data you get will not be trustworthy if you're not calculating your sample size ahead of time because you won't know if you've actually reached a sufficient sample and you won't know how long to run the study. If you're doing these things and not calculating sample size ahead of time, if you end up implementing the test result, it could not be trustworthy, which will hurt your credibility, reputation, and potentially even the company's bottom line. Definitely something you want to avoid. Also, not running a sample size pretest calculation prevents you from knowing the proper testing time frame. So you don't know if you should be running the test for 2 weeks, 6 weeks, 8 weeks, or something else because you don't know how much traffic you need to actually run the test. Now, this brings up another question, which is, well, what is the ideal testing time frame and how much traffic do I need? So it depends on how much traffic you're getting to your site. However, the rule of thumb is between 2 to 6 weeks, up to a maximum of 8 weeks. Now, the reason why we want to do a minimum of 2 weeks is to rule out any discrepancies in the data that could happen, for example, over the weekend, where changes in user behavior, for example, dip, as we can see in this graph here. 6 weeks is typically the max, although you could really go up to 8 weeks. But after that, your data starts to become a little bit muddied and consumer trends may change, especially with seasonal effects. So you want to stick between the 2 to 6 week time frame, although really important to note, if you have a longer sales cycle or sales process, then you should be testing over that period, even if it's longer than 6 to 8 weeks. You want to really tap into your sales cycle to tap into your audience and their behavior. But if you're just running a regular A/B test, not having to worry about seasonal effects or long sales cycles, 2 to 6 weeks is what you want to aim for. Now, if you are not calculating your sample size requirements ahead of time, not only do you not know when to stop your test, but stopping the test too early can mean that you don't have a large enough sample of traffic to actually get statistically significant results, and your sample probably won't be properly powered, meaning the sample size is too low to give you accurate results or to accurately detect an effect. This can cause, in stat speak, what we call a type 1 or a type 2 error. Now, if you're kind of scratching your head going, ooh, I've heard these terms, but I don't really know what they mean, I'm going to explain them to you. So there's 2 errors in testing, type 1 and type 2. A type 1 error is also known as a false positive. So this happens when you incorrectly conclude that there's a significant effect or conversion difference, even though there actually isn't one. A type 2 error is the opposite. It's known as a false negative, and it happens when you fail to detect a significant effect or conversion difference, even though there actually is one. I love to look at this graphic to help me remember because it's very clear. And in this case, the old man can't be pregnant. And in this case, a type 2 error, the lady clearly is pregnant and she's told she's not. So type 1 error, false positive, type 2 error, false negative. You want to avoid both of these in testing. And the way that you can do that is you can ensure you have a proper sample size, which you've calculated ahead of time. The other problem with not knowing how large of a sample you need ahead of time is that you don't know how much traffic you need to properly power your test. And so you can get low sample, underpowered tests that often show exaggerated results. So if you're consistently getting results like a plus 20% lift, a 50% lift, a 300% lift, something great like this is not a success. It's actually showing you your test is probably not properly powered because you don't have a large enough sample size. Your sample size is insufficient, so you're getting exaggerated results. And what happens is that you actually end up having what's known as the winner's curse, which is when a test result initially appears rosy and you may celebrate, but ultimately, once you implement and the variation runs for a longer period of time, you realize, oh, it was a mistake. Calling the winner was premature, and it's actually more worthy of a cry than a celebration because ultimately it's probably going to drag down conversions. So you want to avoid the winner's curse. And the number one way to do this is know how large of a sample size you need ahead of running your study so you don't stop your study prematurely with too small of a sample.
Hi, this is Romo Santiago, founder of Experiment Nation. To celebrate our 5th anniversary, we are holding weekly giveaways until November 29th. Prizes include books, free consultation services, and even a t-shirt. To enter, simply join Experiment Nation Slack and fill out the entry form that can be found in the description or through the QR code on the screen. Now back to the session.
In addition to all these other things I've just mentioned, it's going to be a big waste of your time and resources if you're running tests and you don't know how large of a sample you need. Now, you already know this testing takes time and money. And when you run tests that lead to inaccurate conclusions and you're implementing the result, it's really dangerous. It's potentially pointing you in the wrong direction, and it could have a negative impact on your bottom line, potentially eroding revenue, and worst of all, your reputation. So trustworthy results are key to your success, and therefore you need to do one simple thing to help ensure trustworthy results. What is that? Repeat after me. Calculate sample size requirements ahead of running the study. That is the number one most important thing you can do to help ensure your trustworthy tests. All right, hopefully I've beaten that into your head. Now, you may be asking, okay, I get it, but how do I calculate sample size requirements properly? It's not so easy, but I'm going to walk you through it, and hopefully I'll clarify the complex for you. So we're going to go through how to do it, what calculators to use, and what terms you need to understand in order to be able to properly calculate your sample size. You ready? All right, let's dig in. So first of all, if you're not calculating your sample size ahead of time, I understand. It's intimidating, it can be scary, and I believe you're well-intentioned and you actually want proper test results, but you probably just didn't really know how to do it properly because there's lots of scary stats terms that are kind of intimidating. We're going to get through that. All right, we need to start with the basics. What is sample size anyway? Well, sample size is the number of visitors that you need to accurately run a valid A/B test. So there's a difference between sample size and sample population. Sample population is the group of users who take part in your experiment. Now, ideally, you would target every single person in the world who would be representative of your sample. But that's not realistic. Your sample is always growing, it's always changing, and not every single person is going to go to your website. So you need a small representative sample of your overall target population. The sample size is the number of visitors within your sample population. Your sample population is the people who took part in your experiment out of the overall target population. So hopefully that clarifies it a little bit for you. And as I said, you need a representative sample of people to ensure that all of these people here, even though they may not be in your experiment, represent the people in your experiment so you can get valid results and know how your audience is truly behaving. Now, when running a test, it's really important to have a large enough sample size so the proportion of your users accurately represents your entire audience. And clearly, if your sample size is too small, your results are not going to be representative, but worst off, they're not going to be adequately powered to detect a meaningful effect. And when I say that, what I mean is the results may appear exaggerated, inaccurate, or will not truly represent how your audience actually behaves. So clearly you want to avoid that because you don't want misinformation informing your tests. So here's the problem. In theory, you want to be representing your entire target audience, but you can't truly ever tap every single individual. What you can do is get a broad or large enough slice of your audience to get an accurate picture of how most of your users are going to behave. And so that begs the question, well, what is considered large enough? Now, this question is up for a lot of debate, and every CRO out there will tell you it depends. In actuality, it does not depend at all. It depends on 4 specific factors that you can calculate that are relative to your needs and your test and your traffic. That said, as a very basic rule of thumb, you shouldn't even consider testing unless you have about 30,000 visitors on about 3,000 conversions per variant. But actually, usually, as you're going to see in a second, you need much higher traffic than that. In fact, for an average website, according to the calculations that I've done and that you're going to see in a second, you really need more like 120,000 visitors per variant. And you're going to see why in a second. Now, if that number totally freaks you out, it's okay, because in actuality, true CRO style, it does depend, but what it depends on is 4 factors that we're going to go through right now. So what are those 4 factors? Well, it's your baseline conversion rate, the minimum detectable effect, or MDE, based on a relative or absolute number, the statistical power, and significance level alpha. Now, if these things freak you out and you're like, I don't know what you're talking about, that's okay. We're going to go through them all. So the best way to go through all these terms and actually implement theory into practice is to use a sample size calculator. Now, the sample size calculator is going to help gear you towards figuring out what your sample size requirement actually is. There's a whole bunch of sample size calculators out there. There's Optimizely, CXL, Unbounce, all sorts of them. My favorite one is Evan Miller's calculator because it's very flexible and it's very thorough, and it gives you the ability to tweak a number of different parameters to yield an accurate sample size calculation. So for this presentation, we're going to focus specifically on Evan Miller's calculator, because if you can competently use his calculator, you can accurately use any calculator. So within Evan Miller's calculator, the first thing to note is that you need to input your baseline conversion rate. So that is the original or control version of what you're currently converting at. Now, for a typical e-commerce site, it's about 2 to 5%. If you don't know the baseline conversion rate for the test you're running or the page that you're running on, you might want to put in 2 to 5% if you're an e-commerce site, because that's roughly industry average. Beware though, you want to be conservative in your guess of what your baseline conversion rate is, because lower baseline conversion rates are going to push your sample size requirements up. And it's better to have too much traffic rather than too little traffic. So be conservative. If you don't know your baseline conversion rate, put in 2%. If you know it, which you can get from your analytics data or from previous test data, then input that in your baseline conversion rate. Next is minimum detectable effect. Now, this sounds big and scary, but if we break it down, it's actually quite simple. Minimum means smallest. Effect is the conversion difference between the control and the treatment. And detectable is what you can detect or see from running the experiment. So you're looking for the smallest conversion lift that you're expecting to achieve. Now, it's kind of a tricky concept because how do you possibly know what kind of effect you're going to get from the test? That is why we test. But you sort of have to say, well, based on past experience or based on what I've seen from other tests, I expect that the lift is going to be this much. And you want to input that into your MDE. So it's the smallest conversion lift you're expecting to achieve. Now, there's no magic number for your MDE, and it does depend. However, if you have historical data, plug that in. If you know that a test is only worthwhile running if you run it and get a 2% lift or a 10% lift, put that in. And really importantly, be aware that a standard, realistic, minimum detectable effect for properly powered test tends to be between 2 to 5%. So if you're inputting a 10% MDE or a 30% MDE, unless you have historical data showing that that's actually what you've achieved in the past, you probably are not running a properly powered test. A 2 to 5% MDE is what's considered realistic. So that's what I suggest you put in the MDE slot, 2 to 5%. That's going to give you a realistic effect or lift that you can expect to see from your results. If you don't have enough power to detect an MDE of 5%, the test results are probably not trustworthy. And you should know that the smaller effect, the bigger the sample size you need, and the bigger the effect, the smaller your sample size requirements. So you can tinker with it, but don't fool yourself because you want a large enough sample for your test to be properly powered so you can accurately detect an actual effect. Now, in Evan Miller's calculator, you'll see here the absolute or relative conversion rate difference can be input. And what this means is that you can calculate the effect or the lift in various ways as a relative percentage or an absolute percentage. Most clients are used to seeing a relative percentage, so I suggest that you go with that for your criteria and you input it as the default. Now, if you decide to go with relative, you're going to see it looks like you need a way larger sample size than if you go with absolute. Don't just choose absolute because the sample size looks smaller. It's the way that you're representing the data. So here you're saying you expect to see a relative 1% conversion lift from 0.77 to 0.78. Here, you're saying you expect to achieve an absolute 1% conversion lift from 0.77 to 1.7. So you need to accurately represent the way that you're going to show that conversion lift. And as I said, most clients are used to seeing a relative conversion lift, so stick with that. It does not make the sample size requirements larger. It makes the way that you present the data more realistic. Once you've selected the relative minimum detectable effect, you can then choose the statistical power at which you want to run the experiment. The statistical power is the probability of finding an effect or conversion difference, assuming that there is one. And that's really important because in testing, we can't just assume there's a conversion difference. We have to test to reject our null hypothesis and accept our alternative that there is indeed a difference. So in order to do that, statisticians typically set a power of 0.8 or 80% as the standard best practice. So on your calculator, you can leave this at 80%. And what this means is that there's an 80% chance that if there is an effect or conversion difference, you can accurately detect it without error. In other words, there's only a 20% chance you'd miss properly detecting the effect or committing a type 2 error or false negative. And that's a risk worth taking, so you can leave it, as I said, as the default on the calculator. Now, there is a trade-off here. In testing, your aim is to ensure you have enough power to meaningfully detect a conversion difference. A higher power is always better, but it requires a larger sample size. And the larger your sample size, the higher your power, which is why a large sample size is required for accurate A/B testing. So you can see here at 80%, we need about 120,000 visitors per variant. At 95% power, we need almost 200,000 visitors per variant. So setting it at 80 is considered a nice happy medium. Now the final parameter within our calculator is called significance level alpha. This is like a checkpoint to set our risk tolerance for a type 1 error or a false positive. And as you might remember, a false positive happens when we claim there's a conversion difference, but there's really not. The closer to 0, the lower the probability of a type 1 error, but the higher the probability of a type 2 error. So you want to reach a happy middle ground, which is a generally accepted level around 0.05 or 5%. So on the calculator, you can keep the default at 5%. This means there's a 5% chance of a false positive or a 95% chance the null hypothesis is correct and the treatment is indeed no better than the control. If we put this all together and plug in all the numbers with our low range of 2% and our high range of 5%, you can see the minimum number of visitors required per variant is 1.93 million visitors per variant. Now that's at the very high end. If we go with 5% as our baseline conversion rate and minimum detectable effect, it brings traffic requirements markedly down to only 120,000 visitors per variant. I say only, but that's still an awful lot of traffic, especially for most sites out there. In fact, the average site is getting nowhere near 120,000 visitors per variant. And according to some research that I did, only 12% of the world's sites get this kind of traffic, which means truly trustworthy testing is done by the world's largest elite organizations. If you don't have enough traffic, testing may not be the best approach for you. And you can just leave right now and turn this video off. But recognize that if you do a test and you don't have enough traffic and you're not calculating your sample size requirements ahead of time, your test data likely won't be fully accurate and may only provide loose directional data. To overcome these issues, there are a few things you can do. I recommend you run bigger swing tests and radical redesigns to try and get a larger, more pronounced effect. You can also test across the entire site rather than just specific pages or products. Make sure you're measuring all the way down the funnel. And you can use things like surveys, UX data, heat mapping data, customer feedback, all those types of things to get accurate data that testing just may not be able to provide for you. So in testing, you really need to balance the risk of untrustworthy data with the reward of getting some data, even if it's not totally trustworthy. That's going to be an organizational decision for you, and you need to know if you are close to the traffic requirements, if they're suitable to give you trustworthy-ish results. You need to decide, but no matter what, the most important thing is run your sample size requirements ahead of time to determine how much test traffic you need per variant before you even start the study. Once you've done that, confirm if you have enough traffic to run it across the site or the page, and if you can be running the test within a 2 to 6 week time frame. And finally, once you've started the test, don't peak by looking at the results and then stopping the test early before the sample size requirement has been achieved, because that's going to skew your data and you may end up stopping the test prematurely before the real results have run their full course. If you do end up stopping a test early because it looks like the winner is really persisting, then do monitor and mitigate for big losses. But hopefully you'll be running winning tests and you'll be running it for a long enough time period and it will be properly powered because you've calculated your sample size requirements ahead of time. So that is my big message for you. I will repeat it again. run your sample size requirements ahead of actually starting the study. It's going to save you a whole lot of headache and a whole lot of trouble, helping you increase your revenue and your reputation. I hope you've gotten something valuable out of this presentation, and if you have any questions, feel free to get in touch. GuessTheTest.com or my email, Deborah@GuessTheTest.com. I'll look forward to hearing from you. Thanks so much. Bye.
Hi, this is Romo Santiago, founder of Experiment Nation. To celebrate our 5th anniversary, we are holding weekly giveaways until November 29th. Prizes include books, free consultation services, and even a t-shirt. To enter, simply join Experiment Nation Slack and fill out the entry form that can be found in the description or through the QR code on the screen.